Joining me is Raymond James Senior Chips Analyst Srini Pajjuri. Srini, welcome. Do you like this specific idea or just the idea in general of splitting up design from manufacturing?
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. So I think one of the issues with Intel is that, they have two major segments. One, Intel products, which is in a pretty good shape. It's they do about $50 billion in revenue at 25% operating margin. And, that business is not growing as fast as it used to be, but it's a very stable business. The problem child for them is the foundry, the manufacturing side of things, and where they're losing, last year they lost $13 billion. This year they're probably going to lose about at least $5 billion or so. So that has been the issue, and that's the reason for the stock, underperforming. So if there's a split, we think that the product business alone could be worth, around $32 a share. And, they have other assets as well. They own Altera, which is probably worth about $15 billion. They also own about 85% or so of Mobileye. So all in, we think excluding the manufacturing, the stock could be worth in high 30s or so.
It's funny, though, because from Broadcom's point of view, you think, from Taiwan Semi's point of view, you think they shouldn't get involved.
Well, they're the leader. They're almost a monopoly. The only reason they would get involved here is because they're forced to do so. I don't think voluntarily. I see no reason for them to enable a competitor. Intel is trying to compete with them. But I guess, if they're forced to do it, they have multiple options. One, the whole point of this is to bring more leading edge manufacturing to the U.S. And TSM is already investing in Arizona. They could potentially expand that investment. They've announced that they would be investing about $65 billion or so over the next few years. They could definitely expand that. But I guess taking over Intel's manufacturing is one option. But we think what makes more sense for TSM is to simply expand their own U.S. manufacturing.
And so then going back to Broadcom, and we've seen this company, it has a history of acquisitions. That's why its ticker is still different from the name and everything else. They want the product business, the business that you think is stronger.
Yeah, Broadcom does some manufacturing, but they outsource most of their chips, including their AI chips, to TSMC. So they're really good at running, the so-called fabless model. And I think that's where their interest is in Intel's products. If you look at Broadcom's history, their strategy has always been, cut costs pretty aggressively, which they've done successfully over the years. And also, in many cases, raise prices. They tend to buy the so-called franchises. Where they have a monopoly or a duopoly. Intel's literally in a monopoly in PCs and a duopoly in servers. So I think that fits well with their strategy. But again, the issue here is regulatory front, right? U.S. might say okay because there is not a lot of overlap between Broadcom and Intel's products group. But at the same time, you also need approval from China. That's going to be a challenge because lately China hasn't approved many semiconductor deals.
That's interesting. Quick final question, Srini. Why does the U.S. have to be involved here at all? Is there an argument to be made that absent its involvement, Broadcom would be interested in the product business, the foundry business at some point, at some price, maybe, I don't know what happens to it, but do you think that absent the U.S. involvement, that's why Taiwan Semi is kind of being forced to look at taking that piece of the business?
Yeah, I think U.S. is getting involved because they're worried about Intel's fate. Intel's, the flag bearer for U.S. semiconductor manufacturing. They've been the leader over the last, 20 years or so, and they fell behind and they're struggling. And from a supply chain resiliency standpoint, most of the manufacturing leading edge is still done in Taiwan. So I think, it's very, strategic for U.S. To make sure that Intel is successful, and that's part of it. And then for Broadcom to, make an acquisition, it's not necessary for Intel to succeed. But, if that were to go through, I think U.S. involvement is necessary to get the Chinese approval.